Well, today we are going to look at a beautiful 1977 Oldsmobile 98 Regency, and we're going to actually look at a black four-door sedan, but I want to start it off with this picture of a coupe, because the coupes are, I think, handsome as well, although I have to say this is one of the cars where I enjoy the four-door versus the two-door. Now, one of the amazing things to me is that this Oldsmobile 98 ran all the way through from 1977 to 1984 before it would be replaced by the front-wheel drive Oldsmobile 98 in 1985. And the Oldsmobile 88 would run through the 1985 model year, 1 year later, because the new front-wheel drive Olds 88 would come out for 1986. The amazing thing to me is that these cars really are not all that appreciated in the collector market. In fact, what's bizarre to me is that if you buy a copy from, let's say, one of the latter years, 1983 or 1984, they seem to be worth more than the 1977 to 79 variants. And that just doesn't make any sense to me, because the 1977 to 79 variants are the ones with the really good and much more powerful engines and better transmissions before they were changed for the 1980 model year. More specifically, the Olds 98 for 1977 through 79 came standard with a 350 cubic inch V8, and it came optional with the engine that this car has, the Oldsmobile 403 cubic inch V8. And they were backed by turbohydromatic 400 transmissions, so heavy-duty transmissions. The later Oldsmobile 98s, like the 83 and 1984 variants, came with the Olds 307 V8 and had the 200 4R transmission, which neither of those, they're not bad, a bad combination, but I would much instead prefer the 77 to 79 variants for the reason that I just mentioned. And here is the sedan that we are going to take a look at. This one was actually sold by Orlando Classic Cars a little bit ago, and it had 28,000 miles on it. They have some nice cars, so check out their website, Orlando Classic Cars, again. In any case, for 1977, there were no more four-door hardtops of the full-size vehicles, whether you're talking about Chevrolet, Pontiac, Olds, Buick, or Cadillac. All of the divisions had these pillared four-door sedans. And I think the Olds looks, let's say, the best of the bunch. I don't know, which do you like the best of the Chevrolet, Pontiac, Olds, Buick, and Cadillac? I think the Olds is my favorite. But one of the things that you have to say about the styling here is that GM was executing what it called its sheer look styling. And that was this much more slab-sided architectural design with sharp creases and relatively low tumble home, especially compared to the previous generation variants. And that was because these cars were smaller, the 1971 to 76 models, both physically outside and on the inside, but GM was trying to really preserve the interior roominess. And I have to say they did a great job. That's one of the great things about these cars, is that they were indeed downsized, but they still feel extremely roomy on the inside, and GM engineers were able to preserve much of the space that the original variants had. And so we are left with a car that you see here that has these very architectural cues, but I think it's very handsome. It's a pretty stiff windshield and also a stiff backlight. And this was capitalizing on the styling trend that was set by the 1976 to 79 Seville, but obviously this was on a larger, let's say, platform than that 76 to 79 Seville, which was the smallest Cadillac in the portfolio during which it was sold. Now, it would be hard to call this vehicle small because it still rode atop a 119-inch wheelbase, but it was significantly smaller than the 127-inch wheelbase Olds 98 that came out for the 1976 model year. One thing that I love about the 77 is that the 1976 really represents a transitional year. If you look at the front end of the 76, as you can see in the inset, compared to the 75, it kind of prepares the customer for the styling that was coming up on the 1977 variant that you see here, with those square headlamps and very pronounced and prominent vertically oriented front grille. Now, this particular car does carry a number of Olds 98 cues, like the egg crate grille up front, the split grille that was a hallmark of Oldsmobiles beginning in the 1968 model year. Not sure why Oldsmobile decided to emulate Pontiac, who had had the split grille theme since 1959, but they did beginning in 1968. And you do have a couple things that are interesting, like the lack of the fender skirts on this. The 76 model had fender skirts, and Oldsmobile returned to fender skirts when the car's styling was revised in the 1980 model year. But here for the 1977 variant, it lost the fender skirts. And I actually don't think that was a bad thing. It looks a little bit less hefty in the rear, if that makes sense. And as we rotate around to this side profile that shows the rear of the car, I think this is another reason why I prefer the earlier variants of this model versus the latter ones. And that is, notice how the vertically oriented tail lamps, a hallmark of Olds 98s ever since 1963 when they started emulating Cadillac, are kind of canted forward at a similar angle and rake as the C-pillar. And as the car would evolve, those tail lamps would become more vertical. And I like here the harmony of the angle of the tail lamps and the C-pillar. And then also, it just seems harmonious with the relatively stiff windshield that you see up front. Now, one other thing that I have to say about this Olds 98 that I love about it is it has great proportions in a number of ways. But one of the things I enjoy is that this car has extremely chunky lower, if you will. The lower section below the belt line is pretty big. And it has a relatively thin upper. Look at those toothpick-like A-pillars. Of course, the C-pillar is relatively hefty. But the overall proportion of the car is such that the lowers are much bigger than the upper. And to me, that just gives it this great proportion and look. When you started transitioning from these rear-wheel drive cars into the front-wheel drive cars, they didn't have that same proportion. The upper looked a bit more hefty relative to the overall body, and it kind of had to, I believe, for structural integrity. But here, the toothpick A-pillars and thin B-pillars, I think, just add to that look that this car has a substance to it, let's say, that you just don't see in modern cars. Many modern cars today have very thick roofs, thick A-pillars, thick B-pillars, because of rollover standards. And I really miss the lighter roofs like those that you see on this Olds 98 Regency. Now, if we transition to this particular photo, I'm showing another one of the rear of this vehicle, not because we haven't just seen the rear, but because notice the stabilizer bar in the rear, and it's relatively beefy for this time frame. One thing that you'll note if you drive one of these cars versus the previous generation is that they are much better handlers and easier to, let's say, maneuver in city traffic. They don't lean or wallow. They actually are great driving cars, especially with, like this one has, the Olds 403 V8. It's relatively peppy. So despite the fact that they're a bit physically smaller than the previous generation, they still provide all the luxury that you want and need, and they handle really, really well. Here is one more picture of the dead-on rear, and notice the taillights. Another thing that I like, in addition to the angle that I mentioned, is that they taper as they go upward. The later 98s, the rear-wheel drive 98s, the tail lamp would not taper as it went upward. And here, it just gives, I think, a slimming look to the body from this dead-on rear section. I like it better than the latter variants. And it also seems to complement here the overall width being the widest at the bumper area. And it helps the eye kind of visually see that the body tapers as it goes upward because of some amount of tumble home that this car still has, just not as much as the previous generation. Now, the interior is where this Olds 98 Regency really shines, and I have to say that they did a great job overall. The dashboard on these is relatively uneventful. It obviously has a lot of fake wood on it, and it's pretty flat, and doesn't have the curvature that the previous generation had, either from the 1971-3 variant or the 1974-6 variant. And that was likely done to ensure that passengers felt like there was adequate space inside. Pushing that IP forward lends kind of an air of overall spaciousness to the cabin. And you will see that the seats and their overall design is very similar to what was introduced on the Olds 98 for the 1972 Regency model year, which was when that loose cushion style of seats was inaugurated. And that was done in order to just dress up the Oldsmobile 98 and give it a better interior. And it cost $100 back then to have these loose cushion seats on that 1972 Regency. It proved so popular that Oldsmobile would continue doing it on subsequent 98 Regencies all through even the 1980s. And the door panel is even similar to the 1972 Olds 98 Regencies as well, with I know what you want to call it, that gold filigree-like design that outlines part of the door panel. One other thing I will point out is that for whatever reason, Oldsmobile loved to have supersized accelerator pedals in its car, as well as brake pedals. And yes, a lot of vehicles had big accelerators and brake pedals during this time. Chrysler and Ford didn't usually use the supersized accelerators by this point. Chrysler did have some big ones in the 60s. But Oldsmobile, of all the GM divisions, had a big pedal. So did Buick, but I think the Olds pedal is the cooler one and the better one. Turning now to the back seat, you can see the similar seat design as the front seat. But I will point out, notice the rear seat legroom, which was quite generous in these vehicles. And one would say, well, you expect it to be generous. It's a 119-inch wheelbase car. But truth be told, some full-size cars of this era weren't all that generous in terms of rear seat legroom. And in fact, one of the great things about the downsized Oldsmobile 98 Regency for 1977 was that it preserved this rear seat legroom, and it actually felt even a little bit roomier in the back, perhaps because of the higher roofline, which led to more headroom. And overall, the car was just a comfortable place to be, front or back. And we'll close out our interior discussion with this photo of the front seats, just so you can better see the loose cushion design. I will say one thing, these are relatively comfortable, but they look more comfortable than they actually are. The foam is a little bit stiff on these. You'd actually want it to be a little bit softer in order to provide a commensurate level of comfort. And so the buttons and the pillow stuffing kind of hit you a little bit in the wrong areas in some cases. Although as the seat wears into your individual body and you use the car more, I think it gets increasingly comfortable. But I thought that was interesting that the old seat engineers weren't necessarily focused on seat comfort as much as they were the overall design. Speaking of comfort, take a look at what's on the visor here in this Olds 98. Remember that seat belts were relatively novel during this time frame, and engineers were trying to get people to wear seat belts versus not buckling them at all. And that started with various warning buzzers in the early 1970s cars that many people just disconnected. Here, one of the good things is that you had the integrated lap and shoulder belt as opposed to the ones that would separately buckle. So you really were forced, if you're going to use a seatbelt, to use both the lap and the shoulder belt. Now, some people hated the way that the shoulder belt felt restrictive on their body. And so one of the things the engineers did was that when you pulled out the belt and you buckled it, you could actually, first, you would pull it all the way out a couple inches and release it, and that would tighten the belt around your shoulder. Then they had a design feature such that only when the door was closed, you could pull out that shoulder belt by an inch or a little bit more and relax it, and it would stay relaxed. That was done for comfort so that, again, people were willing to wear the seatbelt. A loose shoulder belt is better than no shoulder belt or no seatbelt at all. So that's what was done. And then what would happen is if you wanted to tighten it back up, you would pull the shoulder belt out several inches and then release, and it would come back taut to your body. So this is something that persisted into, I think for GM vehicles, the late 80s. And it's one of the reasons why the belts will get slack, because that is a purposeful design feature. Now, when you open the door, of course, there needs to be a way for the belt to retract overall. So there's a little plunger inside the pillar. And when you open the door, that plunger releases, and then that takes up the seat belt slack and tension, and then pulls the seat belt back into the retractor assembly. So it was a little bit of a complicated setup, but it persisted, like I said, for many years and was done for overall seat comfort. Now let's transition under hood to the Olds 403 V8 that you see here. This 403 V8 made 185 horsepower and 320 pound-feet of torque. This was the optional engine in this particular year, Olds 98. The standard engine was a 350 cubic inch V8 that made 170 horsepower and 275 pound-feet of torque. And the 403, like I mentioned before, was much more powerful and had much more torque than the Olds 307 that was employed in the latter years. Those Olds 307s were typically around 140 horsepower and made 240 pound-feet of torque versus the 320 that I just said here. So this is a much better powertrain, and you also don't have the electronic feedback quadrajet carburetor to mess with. Although you do see those orange boxes, which are diagnostic terminals for various features that you'd actually plug a diagnostic tool into, and you could see if the AC compressor clutch was cycling appropriately, If it were a later car, there were even more features. But that was kind of the early setup for OBD1 that would come soon thereafter. This was not by any stretch an OBD1 setup, but at least it had some connectors that you could help diagnose various engine systems under hood. You'll also notice that the engineers were very thoughtful and put the blower motor as an exposed component here, as opposed to something that was buried in the fender well, like on the previous generation cars, where it was almost impossible to change and get out. They learned, I guess, their lesson and put it here so it could be easily replaced. Blower motors often went bad on these cars, just due to age and use. But the 403 was a great engine. It was a small block. The 403 was the largest variant Olds small block. It was not a big block. It was physically the small block. And it did have Siamese cylinder walls. Some people will say that it had problems overheating. I've never experienced anything like that unless you have a clogged radiator or an old radiator. But I've never had one run hot. I will say, though, that they do have relatively weak bottom ends. They have hollow main bearing webs. And so you really don't want to keep these things revving above 4,000 RPM for very long. If you just drive them normally, they'll last forever. I mean, of course, you can occasionally floor it, but don't keep the pedal mashed to the floor at 90 miles an hour trying to get to 120 or something like that. I don't even think the car would do 120. Probably will do 115, 110, something like that. So be a little bit gentle on it and don't rev them up, and they will last for a long period of time. And they're torquey and smooth and, just, again, a lot more, let's say, enjoyable to drive a car with this engine than the Olds 307, though the Olds 307 is a good engine too. So there you have it, this discussion of this particular Olds 98. What do you think? Would you buy a 77 to 79 variant? Or would you go for the latter ones? You know what my choice is. Put a comment in the comment section and let me know what you think. Thanks again for watching.